When we left off, Charles I was forced to recall Parliament after 11 long years, due to the Scottish Covenant defeating England in the First Bishops' War. This would mark the beginning of the end for Charles, as relations between him and Parliament would reach a breaking point a few years later. The last video ended with the reassembly of Parliament in April 1640, so this is where we'll begin now. Charles was urged to recall Parliament by Thomas Wentworth. Although the two had a poor relationship in the beginning of Charles's rule, they had grown to become close friends in the personal rule, with Wentworth becoming the Lord Deputy of Ireland. Charles had hoped for a quick and profitable session, which would not happen. The MP, John Pym, would outline Parliament's grievances in a speech, which were infringement of parliamentary liberties, innovations in religion, and violations of popery. The Commons were not prepared to grant Charles money until their grievances had been dealt with. Charles, growing impatient, would dissolve Parliament after just 3 weeks, hence its name, the Short Parliament. In August of 1640, Scottish forces invaded Northumberland, starting the Second Bishops' War. Raising an army was even harder for Charles than last year. Many poorly disciplined troops mutinied. In October, Charles was forced to sign the Treaty of Ripon, which stated that the Scots would occupy Northumberland and County Durham, and were to be paid £850 a day until peace could be made. Charles had no other choice but to summon another parliament in November. This parliament would ultimately be dissolved in 1660, giving it its famous name, the Long Parliament. 3 main issues dominated this parliament: fears of a popish plot to take over the realm, Charles's innovations in the 1630s, and what to do with Wentworth and Laud. In February 1641, the Triennial Act was passed. It mandated the automatic meeting of a parliament every 3 years if it was not called by the Crown. This was highly offensive to Charles, who initially declined to sign it. However, under financial pressure, he eventually gave in. In March of 1641, the trial of Wentworth began. It differed from many trials of the time, as it was held in public and news of it was quickly distributed. As Wentworth had been acting with the king's permission, he could not be charged with treason. He was therefore charged with committing constructive treason, threatening to make divisions between Charles and the people. In a future video, I'll go more in depth with the events in Ireland in this time. Charles was ultimately forced into signing Wentworth's death warrant in May, and on May the 12th he was executed. Charles announced that he was planning to visit Scotland in August, which created fears in Parliament of him possibly bringing an army down to London. Parliament then drew up the 10 propositions in June, which urged Charles to postpone his visit until peace with Scotland was achieved, to dismiss his evil councillors and replace them with MPs, to give full military control of the counties to those who were faithful and trusty, and to exclude Catholic advisers of the Queen and those responsible for the raising of their children. The 10 propositions showed how deep Parliament's distrust of Charles was. No monarch would gladly accept such terms, especially Charles. Throughout the year, remedial measures were introduced. They were an answer to Charles's actions of the 1630s. In July, Star Chamber and the Court of High Commission were abolished. In August, ship money and distraint from knighthood were outlawed. With Wentworth now gone, rebellion broke out in Ireland in November, events which will be looked at greater detail in a future video. Naturally, Charles wished to raise an army to put down the rebellion. However, the ever-paranoid Parliament had fears that Charles would raise an army against them instead. A measure was then passed which stated that the king could only employ councillors to control the train bands with the permission of Parliament. Moderates in Parliament viewed this as a step too far, and divisions in Parliament were forming. November also saw the Grand Remonstrance, a document which stated the wrongdoings of the royal government. Charles's past and present actions were discredited. It was passed by a slim margin of 159 to 148, showing the ever-increasing divisions in Parliament, and an increase for the support of Charles. The 4th of January 1642, Charles entered Parliament with armed soldiers in an attempt to arrest the MPs, Pym, Hampden, Castlereagh, Holles, and Strode, after accusing them of treason. They had already been forewarned and had fled into the city, which was now led by Puritans who refused to hand them over. Outrage at Charles was widespread in the city, so much so that he and many of his moderate MP supporters fled the city just days after the failed arrest. With the departure of most of its moderate members, Parliament would begin to pass a series of measures transferring the Crown's powers into theirs. In March, Parliament passed the Militia Bill, giving Parliament the King's military authority. With the increasing need to take control of the country's arsenals, Charles attempted to capture Hull in April, where a large store of ammunition was held. In June, Royalists invited Parliament to state terms for a settlement. Its response was the 19 Propositions. This would essentially make Parliament the sovereign power, as it would control the King's advisers, the army, the reform and government of the Church, foreign policy, who was allowed to sit at the House of Lords, and the education and marriages of the King's children. Many in the country were angered at Parliament's extreme requests. Charles would obviously not accept these terms. Still looking for a way to raise his arsenal, Royalist forces attempted and failed to capture Manchester in July. Additionally, Parliament voted to raise an army which would be commanded by the Earl of Essex. In early August, the Commons stated that Charles had started a war and declared those who assisted him guilty of high treason. On the 22nd of August 1642, Charles raised his standard in Nottingham and called his supporters to put down Essex's rebellion. This would mark the beginning of the First English Civil War. The first major battle would follow shortly in October, at the Battle of Edge Hill. It saw no real victor, yet it allowed the Royalist forces an open path to London, one which Charles would choose to delay the march on. This would prove to be a terrible decision, as Parliament reorganised its defences in and around London. No such opportunity for the Royalists would be presented for the rest of the war. 3 weeks later, in November, there was another clash at Turnham Green, leading to the withdrawal of Royalist forces to Oxford. By the start of 1643, war still had no end in sight. Charles's aim was for 3 separate armies in the north, west, and southeast to encircle London. The Royalist cavalry commander, Prince Rupert, had managed to capture Bristol, but the other Royalist commanders failed to take the strategic cities of Plymouth and Gloucester. With no other alternative, Parliament was urged into making an alliance with the Scottish. In September 1643, the English Parliament entered into the Solemn League and Covenant with Scotland, under the promise of a Scottish intervention in the north, in return for Presbyterianism to be made the state religion in England. This was horrible news for Charles, who was now himself practically encircled. In response to the Solemn League and Covenant, Charles had 10,000 Protestant troops from Ireland brought over. In July of 1644, Royalist and Parliamentarian Scottish forces met at Marston Moor. It was the biggest single engagement of the whole war, with around a total of 45,000 troops seeing action. Under the command of the brilliant cavalry commander Oliver Cromwell, the Royalists were utterly crushed. However, due to the indecisiveness of the parliamentary generals, the Earl of Essex and Manchester, the Royalist forces were not pursued and finished for good. This would cause the war to extend a further 2 years. Throughout the year, Cromwell would increasingly rise in popularity and power. Eventually, he organised the Eastern Association, an army force which he would form into the New Model Army in February. This was England's first standing professional army. Back in London, Essex and Manchester were removed following their failures to finish off the Royalists. This was done thanks to the Self-Denying Ordinance in April 1645. This was a document which would remove the less resolute commanders from their posts and be reappointed. Thomas Fairfax would then become the Commander-in-Chief of Parliament's army, with Cromwell his second in command. 2 months later in June, the last major battle of the war would take place at the Battle of Naseby. Charles had wished to fight there, ignoring Rupert's advice. The Royalist forces were once again decisively defeated by Cromwell. Things would only get worse for Charles, as the royal baggage train was captured, which contained incriminating documents revealing Charles's attempts at recruiting foreign armies to fight for him. Naseby effectively ended the war, yet it managed to drag out until 1646, with some minor skirmishes. Charles eventually lost Oxford in May 1646 and moved to Newark, where he then gave himself up to the Scots. This would officially mark the end of the First English Civil War, and another 3 years of uneasy relations would follow. Parliament was the first to reach out for a settlement. In July, the Newcastle propositions were drawn up. It stated that in return for making peace and granting the king full honour and safety, Charles should agree to the introduction of Presbyterianism, the giving up of his armies to Parliament, and the dismissal of his ill-advised ministers. Naturally, Charles would prolong negotiations, believing that he had time on his side. Growing impatient, and with the negotiations stretching on for over a year, Cromwell decided to take Charles into army custody. Charles was taken from Northamptonshire to London, where he was confined at Hampton Court. In August, the heads of proposals was drafted. It stated that in return for the restoration of the royal family's honour and freedom, Charles should accept a parliament to be called every 2 years, control of the army and navy to be put under parliament, the removal of bishops' authority in civil matters, the use of the Book of Common Prayer was to no longer be mandatory, and an Act of Indemnity was to be passed which would absolve the army's troops of wartime offences. Charles was unwilling to accept any limitation to his powers, and refused to agree to the proposals. Charles managed to escape army custody in November, and made his way to the Isle of Wight, where he would begin negotiations with the Scots. The agreement between Charles and the Scots were known as the Engagement, which contained the terms that Charles would be restored to the position he held before 1642, and Charles would therefore accept Presbyterianism into England. After learning about the negotiations between Charles and the Scots, Parliament broke off all negotiations with the king. In May 1648, at a prayer meeting in Windsor, a declaration was made stating that a second civil war was unavoidable. The Second English Civil War was not as bloody or catastrophic as the first. With the Royalists now thin in numbers, the Scottish and English Royalists failed to coordinate plans effectively. Under the command of Fairfax and Cromwell, parliamentary forces swiftly destroyed the Royalists. The most notable battle of the war was the Battle of Preston in August, a convincing parliamentary victory. In December, parliamentary commissioners were sent to the Isle of Wight to continue talks. In London, Colonel Pride stood at the door of the Commons and forcibly turned away the MPs who had favoured to continue negotiations with the king. This is what is known as Pride's Purge, and the MPs who still remained became known as the Rump Parliament. The trial of Charles I began in early January 1649. Charles refused to recognise the authority and legitimacy of the court. He claimed that the king cannot be tried by any superior jurisdiction on earth. Due to the slow nature of the trial, Charles was ejected from the trial, and evidence against him would be heard without his presence. He was declared guilty of treason and condemned to death by beheading. On the 30th of January 1649, Charles Stuart was executed in front of the banqueting house of the Palace of Whitehall. For the first and only time in English history, the king had been tried and sentenced to death by his own people. His troublesome and chaotic rule had finally come to an end.